Sunlight, filtered through the emerald canopy of ether, dappled the research outpost floor. Grayson, his face smudged with soil, leaned closer to the holographic projector, rotating the image of a sky seed's root system. Each delicate tendril pulsed with a soft, internal light, a bioluminescent network that hinted at the complex symbiotic relationship between the floating islands and the planet below. He reached out, his finger tracing the ghostly image, a wistful sigh escaping his lips. He'd been on Ethel for 2 years, studying its unique flora, but he was still awestruck by its beauty, its mysteries. He still missed Earth, the crisp air of his Colorado home, the memory of his wife, Elena, a ghost in his own memories. But Ethel, with its vibrant life, was slowly weaving its way into the empty spaces within him. A shift in the air pressure, a subtle change in the scent of the jungle, alerted him to a presence. He turned to see her standing at the edge of the clearing, a figure woven from the very essence of the forest. Rhea. Her bark-like skin shimmered with a subtle, moss-green hue, her bioluminescent leaves, the equivalent of hair in his human understanding, casting a soft, ethereal glow around her. She was an Ethelian, one of the arboreal beings who lived in harmony with the sky seeds. Their initial encounters had been fraught with caution, a silent dance of observation. But slowly, patiently, they had begun to bridge the gap between their species, a fragile understanding blooming between them. Her leaf hair shifted slightly, a color change Grayson had learned to interpret as a greeting. He nodded back, a warmth rising in his chest. He was drawn to her wisdom, to the deep connection she had with her world. And he sensed a flicker of something else in her gaze, something that mirrored his own growing fascination. "The sky seeds are fascinating," he said, knowing she could somehow perceive his words, perhaps through the vibrations in the air. "The way they sustain life, the way they..." He trailed off, realizing he couldn't fully articulate the wonder he felt. Rhea moved closer, her hand, delicate and branch-like, extending towards the projected image. He held his breath as her fingers brushed his, a tingling sensation running up his arm. He hadn't been sure how physical contact would affect her, whether the difference in their biology would cause her harm. But her touch was gentle, almost hesitant, a silent question in itself. He felt a pull, a yearning to understand her, to connect with her on a deeper level. But he also felt a pang of guilt. He was here as a scientist, tasked with gathering knowledge that would benefit humanity. Falling for an alien, an Ethelian, it wasn't part of the mission. Yet, the thought of leaving her, of returning to a life devoid of her presence, felt like another kind of loss he couldn't bear. A tremor shook the ground, a low rumble that echoed through the jungle. Rhea's leaf hair fled a vibrant crimson, a sign of alarm. The air grew heavy with a cloying sweetness, a scent that made Grayson's stomach churn. He saw a subtle darkening on the edges of a nearby plant, a creeping blackness he instinctively recognized as a sign of disease. It was a sign of the blight. He could almost hear the whispers of it. A dark secret of the jungle now revealed. In that moment, Rhea made a choice, a dangerous one. She turned to him, her multifaceted eyes filled with a strange mixture of fear and determination. Then, she vanished into the dense foliage, leaving Grayson alone with a growing sense of dread and the first whispers of a coming storm. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that their fragile peace was about to be shattered. The scent of Rhea lingered in the outpost, a mix of damp earth and something floral, something uniquely her. Grayson couldn't shake the image of her crimson fear as she'd fled, or the creeping blackness that had stained the edge of the leaf. He ran a diagnostic scan on the discolored plant, the results confirming his worst fear, a rapidly spreading fungal infection unlike anything he'd ever encountered. The blight. He had only read about it in hushed whispers in ancient Ethelian texts, a near-mythical plague that had decimated civilization centuries ago. He tried to contact Rhea, sending out a modulated signal designed to mimic her pheromonal communication, a technique he'd been painstakingly developing. He waited, the silence of the jungle pressing in, punctuated only by the hum of the outpost's life support systems. Just as he was about to give up, a faint, shimmering light appeared at the edge of the clearing. Rhea. Relief washed over him, quickly followed by concern. Her leaf hair was a muted brown, a color he associated with sadness, perhaps even shame. He gestured her inside, his heart pounding. He had to know what she knew, the holographic projector still displayed the sky seed's root system. Rhea approached it, her hand hovering over the image. The sky seeds weep, she communicated, her voice a series of clicks and whistles that Grayson, after 2 years, was beginning to understand. The blight, a corruption, born of anger. Over the next few hours, a painstaking dance of fragmented words, gestures, and pheromonal cues, Rhea revealed the source of the blight, a splinter faction of Ethelians, the Purifiers, who believed that the planet's symbiotic relationship with other life forms, including humans, had weakened it. They sought to return Ethel to a pure state, eradicating everything they considered a contaminant. The blight was their weapon. Guilt twisted in Rhea's pheromones. She believed she had betrayed her people by interacting with him, by trusting humanity. He reached out, hesitant, remembering their brief touch earlier. Would she recoil? Instead, she placed her hand over his, the rough texture of her bark-like skin a stark contrast to the warmth of his own. It wasn't a romantic gesture, not in the human sense. It was an act of solidarity, of trust. It was everything. "It's not your fault," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We'll fix this, together." He knew, deep down, that this wasn't just about science anymore. It was about her, about protecting her world, her people. The thought of returning to Earth, a dream he'd clung to for 2 years, suddenly felt hollow. Elena was gone, his past a bittersweet ache. Rhea, Ethel, they represented a new beginning, a chance to build something meaningful amidst the wreckage of his old life. The next day, the blight's presence became undeniable. Darkened leaves wilted, the air heavy with its sickly sweet scent. The outpost's alarms blared, warning of spore contamination. The Purifiers had launched their attack. Rhea turned to Grayson, her leaf hair flickering with a desperate plea. "Help us," she conveyed. "Show them, humans are not the enemy." She then did the unthinkable. She offered to infiltrate the Purifiers' stronghold, a hidden grove deep within the jungle, and attempt to negotiate. It was a suicide mission. The Purifiers would see her as a traitor. "No," Grayson said, his voice sharp with fear. "It's too dangerous." But Rhea's resolve was unwavering. She saw this as her responsibility, a chance to prove that cooperation, not eradication, was the path to survival. She vanished into the jungle, leaving Grayson with a gnawing emptiness. He knew he couldn't let her go alone. He activated the outpost's emergency beacon, knowing it would alert the fleet, jeopardizing his chance to stay on Ethel. It was a price he was willing to pay. He grabbed his sampling kit, his heart heavy, and followed her into the heart of the infected jungle. The tremor that had sent Rhea fleeing returned, stronger this time, shaking the research outpost. Grayson stumbled, catching himself on a workbench littered with soil samples and analysis equipment. The air grew thick, the cloying sweetness intensified, tinged now with the metallic tang of ozone. He understood. The blight wasn't simply a disease, it was a weapon, engineered to spread rapidly, to consume everything in its path. His scientific curiosity warred with a primal fear, a chilling premonition of the devastation to come. He had to find Rhea. He had to know she was safe. He activated his comm unit, but static crackled in his ear. The Purifiers, the rogue Ethelian faction, were jamming the signal, isolating the outpost. They were making their move. He burst from the outpost, ignoring the alarms screaming about spore contamination. The jungle, once vibrant and alive, was already showing signs of decay. Darkened leaves curled inward, and a sickly yellow dust, the blight spores, coated the undergrowth. He followed the faintest trace of Rhea's scent, his heart pounding against his ribs. He pushed through dense foliage, his skin prickling with a sense of being watched. He knew the jungle, its hidden paths, its secret rhythms. But today, it felt alien, hostile. He found her in a small clearing, kneeling beside a withered sapling, her leaf hair a dull, lifeless grey. He'd never seen her like this, so vulnerable. The vibrancy that usually radiated from her was gone, replaced by an aura of grief. He approached her slowly, cautiously. He wanted to touch her, to offer comfort, but he hesitated. Would his touch, his human biology, somehow exacerbate her pain? He remembered the brief contact they'd shared earlier, the strange tingling sensation, the way her hand had felt, both delicate and strong. He knelt beside her, mirroring her posture. "Rhea," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. She looked up, her multifaceted eyes filled with a sorrow that mirrored his own. She didn't speak, but the scent of despair emanating from her was more potent than any words. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers. He saw a flicker of fear in her eyes, but she didn't pull away. He gently placed his hand over hers, the warmth of his skin a stark contrast to the coolness of her bark-like flesh. It wasn't a romantic gesture, not yet. It was an act of shared grief, of silent understanding. It was a bridge between two species, united by a common loss. Suddenly, Rhea stiffened. Her leaf hair fled a vibrant violet, a color he hadn't seen before. "They come," she communicated, her voice strained. "The purifiers, they believe, humans, responsible." The ground trembled again, and the air filled with the roar of approaching aircraft. The purifiers were attacking the outpost, believing humans to be the source of the blight. It was a catastrophic miscalculation, a fatal misunderstanding. "We have to stop them," Grayson said, his voice urgent. He knew that if the purifiers attacked the outpost, the human fleet would retaliate. All-out war would be inevitable. And Rhea, caught in the middle. Rhea stood, her eyes fixed on the approaching aircraft. "I will go," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her pheromones. "I will speak to them. I will show them, humans are not the enemy." Grayson's heart clenched. It was a suicide mission. The purifiers would see her as a traitor, consorting with the humans they sought to destroy. He grabbed her arm, his grip tight. "No, Rhea. It's too dangerous." But Rhea's resolve was unshakable. She looked at him, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. "I must try," she said. "For my people, for you." And then, she was gone, disappearing into the jungle, a flicker of violet light against the encroaching darkness of the blight. Grayson stood there, his hand still outstretched, a hollow ache in his chest. He knew what he had to do. He had to follow her. He had to protect her, even if it meant sacrificing his own chance to return to Earth, to the memory of Elena, to the life he once knew. Ethel, Rhea, they were his future now. He activated his emergency beacon, the signal flashing out into the void, a desperate plea for help, and a silent promise to the woman he was falling in love with. He plunged into the infected jungle, following the faint trace of violet light, his heart heavy, his determination steeled. He was a scientist, yes, but he was also something more. He was a protector, a guardian, a man in love with an alien woman who was willing to risk everything to save both their worlds. The Purifier's attack was swift and brutal. Sleek, bio-engineered attack ships, grown from the very fabric of Ethel itself, swooped down from the sky seeds, unleashing waves of concentrated spores. The outpost shields held, for now, but the air thrummed with the energy of the assault. Grayson, his heart hammering against his ribs, raced to the communications console, frantically trying to override the Purifier's signal jamming. He had to reach the fleet, warn them of the impending disaster. But even if they responded, it would take time, precious time that Ethel might not have. He thought of Rhea, alone, vulnerable, facing the very people who had unleashed this plague. He imagined her, her leaf hair flaring in defiance, trying to reason with them, trying to bridge the gap between their cultures. The thought of her being harmed, of her sacrificing herself for a cause that might already be lost, twisted in his gut. He hadn't realized how deeply she had burrowed into his heart until the fear of losing her became a physical ache. His grief for Elena, a dull ache he'd carried for years, sharpened into a fresh wound. He couldn't lose another person he cared about. He had to reach her. He had to try. He slammed his fist on the console, frustration boiling over. The jamming was too strong. He switched tactics, rerouting power to the outpost's external sensors, trying to pinpoint Rhea's location. He had modified his own comm unit to pick up her unique bioluminescent signature, a faint flicker in the infrared spectrum. It was a long shot, but it was all he had. A tremor rocked the outpost, stronger than before. The shields flickered, threatening to collapse. He saw a flash of violet on the sensor display, a faint signal emanating from a dense grove several kilometers south. Rear. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed a biohazard suit, his heart pounding against his ribs, and raced towards the emergency exit. The alarm screamed, warning him of the dangers outside. But he ignored them. He had to reach her. The jungle was a war zone. Spores rained down like a sickly yellow snow, coating everything in a fine dust. The air was thick with the metallic tang of ozone, and the cloying sweetness of the blight was almost overpowering. He stumbled over fallen branches, the ground slick with decaying vegetation. He fought back the urge to vomit, his stomach churning with fear and the toxic air. He found her in a clearing, surrounded by purifier warriors, their bodies shimmering with an unnatural, almost aggressive luminescence. They were holding her captive, their leaf hair flaring with anger and suspicion. Rhea stood defiant, her violet light flickering weakly, her pheromones conveying a desperate plea for understanding. Grayson knew he couldn't confront them directly. He was outnumbered, outgunned. But he couldn't just stand by and watch her be harmed. He had to do something, anything. He spotted a cluster of skyseed vines hanging down from a floating island overhead. It was a risky maneuver, but it was his only chance. He activated his magnetic grappling hook, aiming for the thickest vine. The hook latched on, and he swung across the clearing, landing behind the purifiers. They turned, startled, their weapons raised. He didn't have a weapon. He had his science. He threw a handful of concentrated growth stimulant, a compound he had developed to accelerate plant growth. It was harmless to Ethelians, but it would cause the surrounding vegetation to erupt in a frenzy of growth, creating a distraction. The vines and leaves around them sprang to life, wrapping around the purifiers, momentarily immobilizing them. He reached Rhea, grabbed her hand, and pulled her towards the jungle's edge. He wasn't sure if his touch would hurt her, but she didn't flinch. Her hand, rough and cool against his, tightened in his grasp. "We have to go," he said, his voice urgent. They ran, the purifier's shouts echoing behind them. He led her through the tangled undergrowth, his heart pounding, his lungs burning. They reached a hidden cave, a small pocket of relative safety amidst the chaos. He collapsed against the cave wall, gasping for breath, Rhea beside him, her leaf hair a dull, anxious brown. He looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just an alien, but a woman, a being of immense courage and compassion. He saw her vulnerability, her fear, her unwavering belief in him, in humanity. He reached out, his hand brushing a stray leaf from her hair. It was a simple gesture, almost involuntary. But the contact sent a shiver through him, a strange mix of fear and longing. He had crossed a line, a boundary he hadn't even realized existed. He was falling in love with her. She turned to him, her multifaceted eyes searching his. He saw a flicker of something in her gaze, something that mirrored his own growing feelings. He leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat. He wanted to kiss her, to taste the alien essence of her, to express the emotions that were swirling inside him. But he hesitated. Would it be a violation? Would she understand? He didn't have to wonder. She leaned into him, her face brushing his cheek. It wasn't a kiss, not in the human sense. But it was a connection, an acknowledgement of the bond that had formed between them, a silent promise amidst the chaos. In that moment, the emergency beacon he'd activated finally broke through the purifier's jamming. The fleet had received his message. They were coming. Relief washed over him, quickly followed by a pang of regret. The fleet's arrival meant his return to Earth was imminent. He would have to leave Ethel, leave Rhea. The thought felt like a physical wound, a tearing of something precious and fragile. He looked at Rhea, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and fear. He knew what he had to do. "They're coming," he said, his voice choked with emotion. "The fleet, they'll help." "But you will leave?" she asked, her pheromones tinged with sadness. He took her hand, his grip tight. No, he said, his voice firm. I'm staying. He squeezed her hand, a silent vow. I'm staying with you. The air in the cave was thick with the scent of damp earth and Rhea's unique floral aroma, a fragrance that both soothed and unsettled Grayson. Outside, the jungle raged with the Blight's relentless advance. Inside, a different kind of storm brewed, a tempest of conflicting emotions. Rhea sat across from him, her bioluminescent leaves dimmed, reflecting her inner turmoil. He could sense her guilt, her fear that her growing connection with him had somehow betrayed her people. It wasn't your fault, he repeated, the words feeling hollow even to his own ears. He wished he could offer her more than empty reassurances, but he was lost in his own internal labyrinth. His duty was to humanity, to the research mission, to the memory of Elena, the wife he'd lost years ago on a ravaged Earth. Yet, here he was, falling for an alien woman, a being from a world so different from his own, a world he had sworn to observe, not become a part of. The purifiers believe, we are weak, Rhea communicated, her voice a series of clicks and whistles that tugged at something deep within him. They believe, symbiosis is a weakness. They're wrong, Grayson said, his voice filled with a conviction that surprised even himself. He realized, with a sudden clarity, that Rhea's philosophy of symbiosis, of interconnectedness, resonated with him more than the detached objectivity of his scientific training. I must show them, Rhea said, her leaf hair flickering with a newfound resolve. I must show them, humans can be allies. Before Grayson could protest, she stood, her eyes fixed on the cave entrance. I will take a sample of the blight to your outpost. Perhaps your science can find a cure. Grayson's heart lurched. It was a reckless plan. The journey to the outpost was treacherous, the air thick with spores. Carrying a sample of the blight increased the risk exponentially. He reached out, his hand closing around her arm. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, unsure how his touch would affect her. He'd felt the tingling sensation before, the strange energy exchange between their different biologies. But this time, it was different. It wasn't a scientific curiosity. It was a plea, a silent command for her to stay. She didn't pull away. Her hand, cool and rough against his skin, tightened in his grasp. He felt a surge of protectiveness, a fierce desire to shield her from the dangers that lay ahead. He wanted to tell her to stay, to hide, to let him face the threat alone. But he saw the unwavering determination in her eyes, the same courage that had led her to reach out to him in the first place, to bridge the gap between their species. He knew he couldn't stop her. Be careful, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. She nodded, a faint violet glow emanating from her leaf hair. Then, she was gone, disappearing into the swirling mists of the infected jungle. Hours crawled by, each one an eternity. Grayson paced the cave, his anxiety growing with each passing moment. He tried to contact the outpost, but the purifier's jamming was still in effect. He imagined Rhea, alone, vulnerable, navigating the treacherous jungle, carrying a deadly cargo. He cursed his own helplessness, his inability to protect her. Finally, a faint signal broke through the static. It was the outpost. The jamming had ceased. He grabbed his comm unit, his heart pounding. Grayson to outpost. Report. We're under attack, a frantic voice crackled back. The purifiers, they think, we're the source of the blight. Grayson's blood ran cold. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. A fatal misunderstanding. He knew he had to reach the outpost, to try and explain, to prevent all-out war. But Rhea. He closed his eyes, his mind racing. He could try to reach the outpost, hope to negotiate with the purifiers, but it was a long shot. And if he failed, Rhea would be alone, facing the wrath of her own people. He made his choice. His duty to humanity warred with his growing feelings for Rhea, and for the first time, humanity lost. He couldn't leave her to face this alone. He activated his tracking device, locking onto Rhea's bioluminescent signature. He had to find her, protect her, even if it meant abandoning his mission, his chance to return to Earth. He grabbed his gear and plunged back into the infected jungle, following the faint violet flicker that represented his future, his hope, his love. The violet flicker of Rhea's bioluminescence guided Grayson through the choking mists of the infected jungle. He pushed through the dense foliage, the air thick with the blight's cloying sweetness and the metallic tang of ozone. He had to reach her, had to know she was safe. The fleet was on its way, a beacon of hope and a harbinger of his departure. But leaving Ethel, leaving Rhea, felt like tearing himself in two. Elena, his lost wife, was a ghost of the past. Rhea, his present, his future, was a fragile bloom amidst a storm. He couldn't lose her. He found her at the base of the highest sky seed, the source of the rare luminescent moss needed for the antidote. The moss, according to Rhea, resonated with the sky seed's energy, amplifying its healing properties. She was gathering samples, her movement swift and precise, her leaf hair shimmering with a determined violet. The sight of her, alive and unharmed, filled him with relief. But the air crackled with danger. The purifiers were close. "We have to go," he said, his voice urgent. Rhea turned, her multifaceted eyes widening in alarm. "They are here," she communicated, the scent of fear sharp in the air. Before Grayson could react, 3 purifier warriors emerged from the surrounding jungle, their bodies glowing with an aggressive luminescence. Their leaf hair flared crimson, their pheromones radiating hostility. They moved to surround Rhea, their weapons raised. Grayson stepped forward, putting himself between Rhea and the purifiers. "We're not your enemy," he said, knowing his words were likely lost on them. He raised his hands in a gesture of peace, but the purifiers remained unmoved. Rhea stepped beside him, her hand finding his. It was the first time they had touched since their brief contact in the cave. Her hand was cool, the texture of her bark-like skin rough against his. The familiar tingling sensation returned, stronger this time, a rush of energy that flowed between them. It wasn't just a physical connection. It was a shared fear, a shared determination. It was a silent promise. He looked at her, his heart pounding. He could feel the tremors of the approaching fleet vibrating through the ground, their arrival imminent. He would have to make a choice. Stay and fight for Rhea, for Ethel, or return to Earth, to a life that now felt empty and meaningless. Rhea met his gaze, her eyes filled with a strange mixture of fear and resolve. She then did the unthinkable. She stepped forward, facing the purifiers alone. "I believe in him," she said, her voice amplified by the sky seed's unique acoustics. "I believe humans can be allies." She held out the luminescent moss, an offering, a plea for understanding. For a moment, the purifiers hesitated, their crimson anger flickering with uncertainty. Then, the lead warrior lunged, knocking the moss from Rhea's hand. It scattered on the ground, its ethereal glow dimming. Grayson saw red. He tackled the purifier warrior, a primal rage surging through him. He fought with a ferocity he didn't know he possessed, his scientific objectivity replaced by a desperate need to protect Rhea. Rhea joined the fray, using her knowledge of the jungle to her advantage, tripping the purifiers with vines and disorienting them with clouds of spores. The fight was chaotic, desperate. Just as Grayson thought they were gaining the upper hand, the ground trembled violently. The fleet had arrived. The purifiers, startled by the arrival of the human ships, retreated into the jungle. Grayson and Rhea stood panting, their bodies bruised, their hearts pounding. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. The arrival of the fleet meant his return to Earth was inevitable. He looked at Rhea, his heart aching. "I have to go," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. Rhea's leaf hair dimmed, her violet light fading to a muted brown. She nodded, her eyes filled with a sorrow that mirrored his own. He saw tears, shimmering like dew, clinging to the edges of her leaves. He reached out, his hand trembling, wanting to touch her, to comfort her, but he hesitated. He wasn't sure if his touch would be welcome, if it would be a comfort or a violation. She didn't hesitate. She stepped forward and gently placed her hand on his cheek, her touch cool and strangely comforting. It wasn't a kiss, not in the human sense. It was a farewell, an acknowledgement of the unspoken feelings that had blossomed between them. "Stay," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the roar of the approaching ships. He looked at her, his heart tearing. He knew what he had to do. He contacted the fleet, his voice strained. "This is Grayson. Stand down. The situation is under control." He then turned to Rhea, his eyes filled with a newfound resolve. "I'm staying," he said, his voice firm. "I'm staying with you." The journey to rebuild Ethel, to bridge the gap between humans and Ethelians, would be long and arduous. They faced condemnation from both sides, suspicion and distrust. Their love, a fragile bloom in a world ravaged by conflict, would be tested time and again. But as they stood together, hand in hand, watching the human ships retreat, they knew they weren't alone. They had each other. And in that shared connection, they found a strength, a hope, a future they would build together, one fragile seed at a time. The air thrummed with the low hum of the sky seed, a vibration that resonated deep within Grayson's bones. He and Rhea stood on a platform of woven vines, high above the jungle canopy, the rare luminescent moss safely secured in his sampling kit. Below, the emerald green was stained with the creeping blackness of the blight, a stark reminder of the battle they had just won, and the larger war still looming. The moss, the key ingredient for the antidote, pulsed with a soft, ethereal light, a beacon of hope in a world teetering on the brink of destruction. He glanced at Rhea, her leaf hair shimmering with a soft violet glow. The Purifier's attack had shaken her, but her resolve remained unbroken. He admired her strength, her unwavering belief in the possibility of peace. He had risked everything for her, for this fragile hope. He had contacted the fleet, alerted them to the Purifier's attack, effectively ending his own chance of returning to Earth. He had chosen Ethel, chosen Rhea, over the ghosts of his past, over the memory of Elena, the wife he had lost on a dying Earth. Ethel, with its vibrant life, with Rhea at its heart, was his future now. He reached out, his hand brushing a stray leaf from her hair. The familiar tingling sensation returned, the strange energy exchange between their different biologies. But this time, it wasn't just a scientific curiosity. It was an expression of gratitude, of admiration, of something more. She turned to him, her multifaceted eyes searching his. He saw a flicker of understanding in their depths, a reflection of his own unspoken feelings. He leaned closer, drawn to her like a moth to a flame. He wanted to kiss her, to taste the alien essence of her, to bridge the gap between their species with a single, unifying touch. But he hesitated. He wasn't sure if his touch would be welcome, if it would be a comfort or a violation. Their understanding of intimacy, of love, might be vastly different. She didn't pull away. She tilted her head, her leaf hair brushing his cheek. It wasn't a kiss, not in the human sense. But it was a connection, an acknowledgement of the unspoken bond that had formed between them. It was a silent promise in a world filled with uncertainty. The ground trembled beneath their feet, a low rumble that echoed through the sky seed. The fleet was approaching. Their arrival brought a wave of relief, but also a pang of apprehension. How would the fleet react to his decision to stay? How would Rhea's people, the Ethelians, view their alliance? Their love, a fragile bloom amidst the chaos, would face scrutiny, condemnation, perhaps even outright hostility. "They're here," he said, his voice barely a whisper above the rising hum of the approaching ships. Rhea nodded, her leaf hair dimming slightly. He could sense her anxiety, her fear of the unknown. He took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. Her hand was cool, the texture of her bark-like skin rough against his. But the contact was reassuring, grounding. As the first human ship descended through the swirling mists, casting a long shadow over the sky seed, Grayson and Rhea stood hand in hand, a small island of defiance in a sea of uncertainty. Their love, a whisper amidst the roar of approaching engines, was a testament to the power of connection, a bridge between two worlds, a fragile seed of hope in a galaxy teetering on the brink of war. They knew the road ahead would be difficult, fraught with danger and prejudice. But as they looked into each other's eyes, they found a strength, a resolve, a shared belief in the possibility of a future where humans and Ethelians could not only coexist, but thrive together. The whispers of the sky seed, once a warning of impending doom, now carried a new message, a message of hope, of love, of the enduring power of connection in a universe vast and unforgiving. The wind whipped around them, carrying the acrid scent of burning vegetation and the sickly sweet odor of the blight. From their vantage point on the Skyseed platform, Grayson and Rhea watched as the human fleet descended through Ethel's atmosphere, a storm of metal and light against the emerald backdrop of the jungle. The purifiers attack ships, bioengineered horrors grown from the very fabric of Ethel, scattered before the superior firepower of the human vessels. The battle was won, for now. But the war, Grayson knew, was far from over. He glanced at Rhea, her leaf hair flickering with a nervous violet luminescence. Her hand, still clasped in his, was cool and firm. He squeezed gently, drawing strength from her unwavering presence. The arrival of the fleet meant his return to Earth was imminent, a return to a life that now felt like a distant dream. Elena, his lost wife, a casualty of Earth's ravaged ecosystem, was a ghost of his past. Rhea, with her quiet strength, her unwavering belief in the possibility of peace, was his present, his future. "It is done," Rhea communicated, her voice a series of clicks and whistles that, after 2 years on Ethel, he understood as a statement, not a question. "For now," Grayson replied, his voice tinged with a weariness that went beyond the physical exhaustion of the battle. He activated his comm unit, bracing himself for the inevitable order to return to the fleet. Grayson to flagship. "Report." "Grayson, what in the blazes is going on down there?" a gruff voice barked back. "We detected purifier activity, a full-scale assault on the outpost." "Explain yourself." Grayson hesitated, his gaze fixed on Rhea's multifaceted eyes. He knew what he should say. He should report the purifier's aggression, request reinforcements, reaffirm his loyalty to the mission, to humanity. But the words caught in his throat. He looked at Rhea, her hand still clasped in his, a silent testament to their shared struggle, their fragile bond. He couldn't leave her. Not now. Not ever. "The situation is contained," he said, his voice strained. "The purifiers, they misinterpreted our intentions. We're working to establish a dialogue." "Dialogue," the voice on the comm unit sputtered. "They're attacking our outpost, Grayson. You're jeopardizing the entire mission." Grayson closed his eyes, his mind racing. He had to make a choice. He could obey orders, return to the fleet, abandon Rhea and Ethel to an uncertain future. Or he could stay, fight for the fragile peace he believed was possible, a peace built not on conquest, but on understanding, on connection, on love. He opened his eyes, his gaze locking with Rhea's. He saw a flicker of hope in her violet luminescence, a silent plea for him to stay. He made his choice. "I'm staying," he said, his voice firm. "I'm staying with them." The silence on the other end of the comm unit was deafening. Then, a sigh, heavy with resignation. "Grayson, you're making a mistake. You're on your own now." The comm unit clicked off. He had severed his ties with humanity, with his past, with the memory of Elena. He was adrift in a sea of uncertainty, a lone human on an alien world, his only anchor the woman standing beside him, her hand warm in his. Rhea turned to him, her eyes filled with a strange mix of gratitude and concern. She didn't speak, but her pheromones, a complex symphony of sense and emotions, conveyed more than words ever could. She understood the sacrifice he had made, the risk he had taken. She understood his love. He leaned closer, drawn to her like a moth to a flame. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking the rough texture of her bark-like skin. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, unsure how his touch would affect her. But she didn't flinch. She leaned into his touch, her leaf hair brushing his cheek. He closed his eyes and kissed her. It wasn't like any kiss he had ever experienced. It was a fusion of textures and scents, of human warmth and alien coolness, a bridge between two worlds, two species, two hearts. It was a promise, a beginning, a fragile seed of hope planted in the fertile ground of their shared future. The road ahead would be long and difficult. They faced suspicion and distrust from both humans and Ethelians. Their love, a fragile bloom amidst the wreckage of war, would be tested time and again. But as they stood together, hand in hand, on the platform of woven vines, watching the human fleet retreat into the swirling mists, they knew they weren't alone. They had each other. And in that shared connection, in that quiet refuge amidst the galactic storm, they found a strength, a hope, a future they would build together, one fragile seed, one shared breath, one stolen kiss, at a time. The gentle hum of the sky seed, once a comforting lullaby, now vibrated with a nervous energy, mirroring Grayson's own. Ethel's sun, a pale emerald disk in the turquoise sky, cast long shadows across the ravaged jungle. The Blight's retreat was visible even from this height, patches of vibrant green emerging from the receding blackness. But the scars remained, etched deep into the landscape, a stark reminder of the near catastrophe. The antidote, synthesized from the luminescent moss and Earth's own resilient fungi, was working. A fragile victory, hard won, but a victory nonetheless. Rhea stood beside him, her leaf hair a muted green, reflecting the tentative peace that had settled over Ethel. He could sense her exhaustion, her relief, and something else, a quiet sadness that mirrored his own. The fleet had departed, taking with them the last vestiges of his connection to Earth, to his past, to the memory of Elena. He had made his choice. He had stayed. "It is quiet now," Rhea communicated, her voice a series of soft clicks and whistles. He understood, not just the words, but the unspoken emotions that lay beneath. The silence, after weeks of constant tension, was almost unnerving. He reached out, his hand finding hers. Her skin, cool and rough beneath his touch, sent the familiar tingling sensation through his arm. He wasn't sure if it was a biological reaction, or something more, a connection that transcended their different forms. He intertwined his fingers with hers, a silent affirmation of his choice, his commitment. She turned to him, her multifaceted eyes searching his. He saw a flicker of something in her gaze, something that resonated with the unfamiliar emotion swirling within him. Gratitude? Affection? He wasn't sure. He only knew that he wanted to stay, to rebuild this world with her, to forge a new future from the ashes of the old. He leaned closer, drawn to her like a moth to a flame. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently caressing her bark-like skin. He hesitated, a flicker of doubt surfacing. Would his touch, his human warmth, harm her? Would she understand his intentions? She didn't flinch. She tilted her head, her leaf hair brushing his cheek. He closed his eyes and kissed her. It wasn't like any kiss he had ever known. It was a fusion of textures and temperatures, of human and alien, a silent conversation between two vastly different beings, a bridge between two worlds. She pulled back slightly, her eyes searching his. He saw a flicker of surprise, of curiosity, perhaps even a hint of pleasure? He couldn't be sure. Their languages, both verbal and physical, were still so new, so unfamiliar. But there was a connection, a spark, a fragile understanding that transcended words. A low rumble vibrated through the sky seed, a reminder of the precarious peace they had achieved. He knew their union wouldn't be easy. The Ethelians, even those who supported Rhea, viewed him with suspicion, a remnant of the Purifier's propaganda. And the human fleet, his own people, considered him a traitor, a deserter. They were alone, adrift in a sea of uncertainty, their love a fragile bloom amidst the wreckage of war. "We have much work to do," Rhea communicated, her voice soft but firm. He nodded, squeezing her hand. He knew the road ahead would be long and arduous. They would face prejudice, hostility, perhaps even outright violence. But as he looked into Rhea's eyes, he saw a strength, a resilience, a shared belief in the possibility of a better future. He had lost Elena, his past, his connection to Earth. But here, on Ethel, with Rhea by his side, he had found something new, something precious, something worth fighting for. He pulled her close, their bodies touching, human warmth against alien coolness, a silent embrace amidst the vastness of the galaxy. Their love, a whisper amidst the storm, was a fragile seed of hope, a testament to the enduring power of connection in a universe often indifferent to such fragile things. He didn't know what the future held. He didn't know if their love would survive the trials ahead. But in that moment, standing hand in hand on the Skyseed platform, with the ravaged jungle spread out beneath them and the vastness of space stretching out beyond, he knew he wasn't alone. He had Rhea. And that, he realized, was all that mattered.